village by the sea. Fishing boats, cottages and a gorgeous view. A perfect place to escape from a busy world. But dig deeper and there's another story to tell. I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist I want to explore the places where we live to see how they've changed and hopefully dig out the odd surprise about their past. Our coastal villages are often seen as remote outposts, places of retreat and relaxation, but they've been on the front line of history, from the arrival of Christianity to desperate battles with neighbours and nature, from slave trading to the birth of modern tourism. This is Robin Hood's Bay on the Yorkshire coast. It may look pretty, but don't be fooled. In the 1700s and 1800s, this place was lawless. Fearless and resourceful. This is a story of people who turned from crime to honest prosperity. But how did that happen? And how did we end up with the village that we see today? In Robin Hood's Bay, the houses are built into a steep ravine, a haphazard crowd of red roofs tumbling towards the sea. Nobody knows how the village got its name, but it certainly lived up to it. The very first written reference to the place in the 14th century concerns piracy. By the early 1700s, it was the smuggling capital of the East Coast, and it's easy to see why. This place was custom-made for smugglers. The village is isolated and backed by inaccessible moors. From the cliffs, smugglers could signal to supply ships out at sea. Smuggling was at its peak in the 1700s when the government put hefty import duties on luxury goods such as tea, tobacco and silk to pay for wars with France. Once the booty was landed, the maze of narrow streets was perfect for ferrying contraband and giving revenue men the slip. It's said that a barrel of brandy could make its way up from the docks to the top of the cliff without ever seeing the light of day.
So this is what's known as the Smuggler's Tunnel.
With the help of Maria Calderon, I'm putting that theory to the test.
Looks a bit uneven here, isn't
It
it?
is, be careful.
Yeah.
So this tunnel runs under lots of houses in Robin Hood's Bay. Originally it would have just been a beck and people built over it. People needed space for building more houses. There's not much land here. But it was obviously adapted in later times when people started smuggling a lot.
Smuggling was big business.
It was huge.
At one point, 80% of all the tea drunk in Britain was smuggled.
There's lots of different holes in the roof of this tunnel. Look at this.
Oh, yes.
And that's directly under with where we are, lined up under one of the houses in Robin Hood's Bay.
So, presumably there's all sorts of drains and stuff. Maybe they were lowering buckets in to get water out or chucking slops down here.
Exactly. Having access to this water would have had multiple uses.
But one of the uses could be
For smuggling.
pushing the contraband up there. So there you go, there's the tea, a little bit of silk, a little bit of brandy, in you go. Someone at the top there takes it up.
Exactly.
Cover the hole back up again.
And no one would know anymore. You can see in places how close we are to the houses.
Oh, look at those timbers, look at the size of those.
These beams were probably taken from shipwrecks, and amazingly, we can hear footsteps above us.
I can. We're right underneath someone's house.
We are.
Should we give it a...
Go on. Maybe they can't hear us as much. Sound. Oh!
Knocked back. We've been rumbled.
We have.
No, that's the recipient of the contraband.
Now it's safe to pass it.
They're expecting the delivery. That was the signal. And it goes on and on and on. Look at that.
And who knows how many more there are further up that tunnel.
So what do you reckon then? Do you reckon they really could have got contraband goods right up to the top of the village in tunnels like this?
I think there's a bit of an exaggeration, a bit of artistic licence there, but I don't think you're too far off, but you definitely would have utilised this tunnel and other little hidey holes to get things from here to wherever they needed to be under the cover of darkness. It was a smuggler's dream, really.
Everyone in the village wanted a piece of that dream. The evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. This is a typical Robin Hood's Bay cottage, but it hides a wealth of secrets.
Good grief. Oh. Ah, cellar. Well, well. And, oh, this is suspicious. Breeze blocks there look to be blocking up another opening. See where the stonework ends just here? There's a rumour that a long time ago a child broke through here and found a passage that led behind these houses and all the way to the Laurel Inn. And you just wonder, these networks of passages, these secret holes, how many barrels of grog came this way under the nose of the customs officials.
And there are more secrets to be revealed beneath my feet.
Let's have a look. Luckily, the corner's broken. And I can see into it. I think that's the back wall of it. It's big. There's a big chamber under here. I wonder if this connects to another bit of the drainage system, the culvert, and is another little passage that leads down the street. I'd like to prise up this flagstone and have a look, but I don't think the owners would thank me for doing that.
But a small camera reveals a purpose-built storage chamber hidden under the floor.
Sadly, no brandy.
Once at the cliff top, the booty would be handed over to runners and sold for a handsome profit all over the north.
Smuggling was a highly dangerous business, but the rewards could make it well worth the risk. Just a pound of tea could net a smuggler the equivalent of a week's wages. In theory, if you got caught, you faced the death penalty. But in practice, things were a little bit more complicated.
The Crown's revenue men proved almost powerless to stop the smugglers. Mark Newman is an archaeologist for the National Trust.
There's an expectation from London that if you have an officer of the law present, everybody will follow the law and pay their dues. London's a long way away from the Yorkshire coast.
Yes.
And when the whole countryside is signed up to this, so the people living in the village and the gentry living in the large houses around are all part of the industry. The ones up on top of the hill are bankrolling it all. The odds are pretty much against your poor old riding officer.
Millions were being lost in tax revenue, but when the Crown clamped down on Robin Hood's Bay, it triggered an extraordinary act of rebellion.
This may not look exactly like the front row of organised crime, but in 1779 that's just what it was.
Here at the old Fisherman's Arms late one night, excise men decided to hold contraband seized from a raid on the smugglers.
That's the point at which the organised crime, the rest of the smugglers, this whole community, decide that they're not going to take that as the end result. And a pitched battle takes place.
This is your livelihood, but you're also fighting for your life.
This is about real physical combat. And amongst the cache of stuff that was in here were the smugglers' supply of blunderbusses and cutlasses and cartridge boxes, the wherewithal to really put up a fight. And amongst the things that the crowd made absolutely sure they got back were those weapons, so they were fit to fight another day.
Oh, I'm going to leave her.
These days, all the drink in Robin Hood's Bay is legal.
Yes, I'm going to leave her. Shallow.
The grand old days of smuggling had come to an end.
In 1816, when the wars with France ended, certain taxes were lifted, and higher penalties for smuggling meant that what locals called free trading petered out.
The people of Robin Hood's Bay were forced to fall back on fishing. I'm on a traditional boat called a cobble.
It's exactly the kind of fishing boat that launched out of here for hundreds of years.
The design hasn't changed in all that time. Skippering these nimble boats is a skilled job on what's usually a choppy North Sea.
How deep is it?
It's about 30 feet here.
30 feet, crikey, there's quite a lot of winding in to do.
Yeah.
Rob Clarkson has fished these waters all his life.
Okay, are we going to be in luck? Yes, wonderful. There we are. Don't get your fingers in that one.
No, good Lord.
Don't take your fingers off, and it's a male lobster. It's got to be 87 millimetres to keep it from the back of its eye socket to the end of this rigid carapace.
Okay, so it's what's
which you
that?
gauge. This one will be legal.
Lobster has always been caught here, but in the old days the catches were much more varied.
In the day there would be cod, haddock, whiting, things of that sort, halibut, plaice. The seabed here is all rocks and scars and kelp, etc. So it's a perfect habitat for many fish, basically. And of course they only had oars and a simple sail, so they couldn't go a very long way.
So what's the fate of this one?
It's going to go back.
It's your lucky day.
Yeah, it's your lucky
Your
day.
lucky
Yeah,
day.
yeah, it's going to go back now.
Cheerio, fella.
Off you go.
At the height of the village fishing trade in the early 1800s, there were 45 of these cobbles. With their distinctive sails, it must have been an incredible sight. Fishing was the mainstay of the village for hundreds of years. It was not always the picture-perfect place we see today. Dr. Rob Robinson is a maritime historian.
The smell would have been terrible, by our standards, much grimier. It was a place steeped in the business of fish. Fish would be brought ashore, split, salted and dried, and to do that you needed every space available. So not only were the paddocks and the rocks around the village covered in drying fish during the season, but also a lot of the alleyways and the streets and everywhere where there was flat. The smell, we would have noticed it pretty strongly.
We'd be fighting our way through racks of drying fish then.
We would indeed.
And what's the market for this fish? It's not all being consumed here, of course.
Oh, by no means. Much of this fish, or certainly the dried cod, was being sold abroad, was being sold to the Iberian Peninsula, to Spain, to Portugal, even to the Mediterranean. And this fish produced in this area, at the time, is some of the best in the world. It's a hard, cold, gruelling job. Everybody in the community was involved in making fishing a success. It wasn't just the men at sea, but it was everybody. The women had to collect the bait. The women helped bait the long lines. And even the old men, who were too old perhaps to take the big vessels to sea, they would still be going to catching crabs and the like in the bay and taking the very young lads to sea. So they were getting their first taste of life afloat.
Robin Hood's Bay was trading fish caught in those tiny cobbles on an international scale.
What we've got to really remember of here is that we've got the maritime M1 of the 17th and 18th century. People and ships from this area opened up the world.
Some traditions still exist, just. Deb Galanders is keeping alive the art of Ganzi knitting. These were the warm woolen jumpers worn by the fishermen.
One of the defining features is that a ganzi is knitted in the round, so there are no side seams, there's no stitching up.
Well, doesn't that just make it very, very difficult, doesn't it?
No, it makes it really easy. My tension is about 11 stitches to the inch, and knitters watching us now will go, 11? Is she kidding? Why is she so cruel to herself? Well, I want a wind-proof garment.
Yeah.
It's working gear. Every single point of the construction has got a reason for it. So they're knitted quite long, so that when you bend over, it still keeps your back warm. They're tightly fitting, so that you don't get caught in the gear. The sleeves are also a bit short, so that you're not constantly doing that.
They take about 100 hours to knit, and there were no patterns to follow. The skills were passed down through generations who couldn't read or write.
This is a Whitby pattern, rope and ladders.
Oh, that's really interesting. So the patterns vary from place to place?
Yes, yeah. So this one is associated nowadays with Robin Hood's Bay. It's single moss and cable.
There's a widely held belief that ganzis were used to identify the bodies of fishermen washed up on the shore, but that's unlikely to be the original purpose. These were working garments.
Do you want to go?
Well, you've set the benchmark now, haven't you?
Goes through there like that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Go on then.
Okay, that goes round the back. Like
Exactly
so.
right. Yeah, keep
Yeah.
it reasonably
Tight.
firm. Yeah.
Yeah. I've got to the neck here. I'm going to ruin your
No, you won't. We'll just
ganzi.
give it a little bit of looseness there.
Yeah.
And you've
This
done
is-
it.
That was hopeless.
The people of Robin Hood's Bay lived by and for the sea. Their lives were governed by it.
Look at the way the village is built into this natural ravine. All the houses are clustered at the bottom of the ravine. They're not high up on the cliffs. They're not exposed to the wind and the waves. They're faced inwards towards the street.
They are huddled away from the waters that have shaped this village.
This is King Street, and this was the main road in and out of Robin Hood's Bay. But it isn't anymore. It just stops abruptly here, and there's a sheer cliff. And that's because in 1780, a storm swept the cliff away here and sent 22 cottages tumbling into the North Sea. You cannot underestimate the power of the North Sea. Even on a fine day like today, the breeze is whipping up the waves and they're crashing into this dock here. It's said that in one particular fierce storm, the bowsprit of a ship smashed through a window of the Bay Hotel.
The villagers were masters at seafaring, a skill highly prized in the 17 and 1800s when Britain was constantly at war. Robin Hood's Bay was a regular point of call for the press gangs who captured men and forced them into the Navy. Alan Staniforth is a local historian. We're on a street appropriately called The Bolts.
It was one of the many places that people would escape from the press gang.
Oh, literally bolting down
Literally bolting up into the valley and out onto the moors. And obviously local fishermen and mariners were ideal people. If you were captured, you were likely to be whisked off to the Navy for years at a time.
The fishermen were desperate to escape a harsh life of war, disease and scurvy.
In the village, if they were aware the press gang was coming, they would beat the drum so that the men would be aware, and they would scarper up places like this up onto the moor out of sight. And if the press gang persisted, the women reputedly poured boiling water or even urine down onto them.
These feisty villagers fought off the press gangs, just as they'd fought off the customs men. And smugglers' tunnels were perfect escape routes for fishermen. They had good reason to be so protective of each other. They were defending their own. The evidence is in the censuses kept at the village museum.
The fascinating thing is that you get regular repeats of common names. Bedlington, for example, is a common name. Granger, Cooper. We have a whole page full of Storm family, and many of them all living next door to each other, down the street.
So your neighbours, also your relatives.
Indeed, there was a lot of intermarriage between the families, of course.
It's not so much a collection of different families as almost like one extended family.
It is really. You couldn't keep a secret, I wouldn't think, in a village like this in those days.
Some of the old family names live on here today.
Well, I'm John Fewster. This is my wife, Trish. Trish is Dennis's second cousin.
My father's name was Granger, so I'm from the Grangers, and on the mother's side was Crosby.
Don't the Storms come into it somewhere as well?
Yes, well, nearly every Bay family is related to the Storms.
The Grangers' records go back to 1736.
Right.
The ladies' names are the ones that go back the furthest. Often young men who came because they knew that there was money to be made in Robin Hood's Bay, you see.
I don't want to cast any aspersions here, but could it be that some of your relatives and ancestors were involved in this smuggling business?
I'm sure they were. Don't want to go too far back into it.
We know nothing about it.
A lost way of village life is just within reach of living memory.
Looking back, it was lovely with lots of freedom.
We knew everybody. And it wasn't till we moved away and we realised that, you're very, very insular.
It was a life little changed in more than 100 years. For the resourceful people of Robin Hood's Bay, there was never a shortage of opportunities on this coast.
These are whale jawbones, and why are they here? Well, it's because villagers of Robin Hood's Bay found themselves at the heart of one of Britain's biggest industries, whaling.
From the 1750s onwards, village men set sail on the whaling ships from Whitby, bound for Arctic waters, the great Greenland fishing fields. In the Whitby Museum, archivist Fiona Barnard shows me an extraordinary record of the whaling ship the Volunteer, finely carved on a whale's tooth.
And here she is, a very fine three-masted sailing ship, and on the other side we have a picture of a whaling scene off Spitsbergen. It's quite fanciful. There's an awful lot of whales in it.
Yes, yeah, it looks like they're leaping out of the sea, just waiting to be caught.
The Volunteer sailed from Whitby in 1772, just as the lucrative whaling industry was beginning to boom.
You can see all the different jobs that the crew did, and you can see also where they came from. And there's two men on this one that are from Robin Hood's Bay.
They're described as boat steer, is that? Boat steers, sort of helmsmen.
The whaling ship each has 6 to 8 small boats that go down and row after the whale when it's sighted, and each of those has a boat steerer to keep it on track.
It was a highly dangerous job, but Robin Hood's Bay men, schooled in fishing cobbles, had the perfect skills. Whales were plentiful, and the blubber was the prize. In the days before petroleum, whale oil lit the lamps and oiled the machines of the new factories and mills.
Amazingly, we've also got in our archive this little book by the ship's surgeon.
Oh, this is amazing. Oh, this is the bit. Oh, he's describing the whale itself, about 50 or 60 feet in length. His tongue is said to weigh above 4 ton and as big as a large feather bed. Good heavens.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about blood in the water and the beating of the waves with his tail and the foam and the boats coming to... I mean, this is dramatic stuff.
It is very dramatic. He doesn't pull any punches.
And it's the death of a beautiful creature as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Is there a sense that there's any regret about what they're doing here?
Generally not, because they see it as just part of God's plan to give them these lovely docile creatures to harvest.
It's what we call a very busy churchyard, because there are so many stones packed into such a small space.
Yes.
Nearly 900, in fact.
900, good grief.
Yeah, that's because a lot of them were sailors lost at sea, although some of them were not actually buried here. Others would have been brought back.
Deaths at sea were commonplace and keenly felt in a small, tight-knit community.
Oh, these are familiar names.
Every family in the village would have experienced loss at sea at some stage. All the local names are recorded in the churchyard here.
This memorial shows just how the villagers felt about death at sea. In January 1881, during a huge storm, the ship the Visitor struck rocks off Robin Hood's Bay.
Our local lifeboat was past repair and couldn't get out, so a telegram was sent to Whitby to ask if they could get their lifeboat out to help the wrecked sailors.
The seas were so treacherous, the lifeboat was dragged up over the moor, 6 miles through snowdrifts. 200 men cleared the way ahead, 18 horses heaved at the tow lines.
It's just unbelievable if it hadn't happened.
There's obviously a huge degree of urgency here. I mean, there's lives at stake. They're being thrashed about by the waves out there. So it's a maximum effort to get...
They're determined to get here at all costs, and they did.
Led by coxswain Henry Freeman, the lifeboat saved every soul from the wreck of the Visitor. In the end, the isolation of Robin Hood's Bay hampered the ambition of the villagers.
Just look at the dock area again. There's no harbour walls out there. This place is not suitable for the great whaling ships, the steam-driven fishing boats. It's fine for shallow-bottom boats like the cobbles here, but Robin Hood's Bay just couldn't develop into an industrial fishing port.
Which is why the old village hasn't really changed in over 100 years. Unless you look carefully, you'd never guess it was once lawless, populated by smugglers and fighters, fishermen and whalers.
It's all about geography. The sea made Robin Hood's Bay difficult to get to unless you were in the know, and it was virtually unapproachable from land, secretive, hidden away. It's this relative isolation that eventually caused its downfall. But today, it's thriving again, the secret's out, and people come from miles around to enjoy the simple pleasures of this village by the sea.